Welcome in, everybody, to Go Big or Go Home. This is the first ever episode. I am that old man, Troy, joined by that youngster kid, Cunny, over on the other, well, you're not really on the other side of the country right now. You're just south of me, down in the great state of Florida, but you told me you were packing. You moving? What's going on?
I know, I'm moving, but the issue is I'm staying in Florida, so I'm not really making this huge move. I'm going from Orlando to Jacksonville, so I guess technically I'm moving, but it's 3 hours north, but still way south of you, down in Florida.
Yeah, you just couldn't get away from your northern roots. You had to move north, didn't you?
Exactly, little by little.
3 hours at a time.
I'll creep into Georgia.
3 hours at a time, right?
That's the plan. That's my hope.
Well, you know what, Kevin? I am actually very honored, privileged that you and I get to do this show. So I know it's our first ever episode. Just going to fill the listeners in a little bit. Kevin and I, there may be this age difference amongst us, but we do have a connection. And Kevin, I'll let you share the connection. I'll let you share the connection with our listeners.
Okay. Well, starting with the age difference, I'm at 25, and Troy, I think he's 28, 29, something like that. So it's not as big as it may sound, but I kid. I kid he's a little older than 29, but not too much older.
Yeah.
So
right. I'm stuck at the 29. Stuck at 29.
Yeah. Troy was so honored to have me on. He had a podcast going for a network that he created with another guy, and they had me on. He graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Whitewater a few years ago. We'll put it at that. And I was a senior at University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, and so he came to me and wanted to learn about the football team because they were going on another run. UW-Whitewater's certainly got a historic, especially recent history. Their football program's always in it, whether it's them or Mount Union, except for this past year, of course. They're winning the D3 title in football. So he had me on as the sports editor of their student paper when I was a senior, and that's kind of how we met. That's how we got our little clique going and talked about football. And eventually, once the UW-Whitewater football season ended, they won the title for D3 that year. Then basketball was starting up, and so we talked about basketball, and since then we basically hit it off. I was a guest on your show God knows how many times, but yeah, since then it all started with our little UW-Whitewater connection.
Yeah, and then through the course of time I found out you liked the football version, the European football version of soccer, so I had you on Soccer Savvy. We've done all these things together. Now finally we get to connect and do our own show. It's going to be great. So not to bore the listeners anymore, but this is a Big Ten show. Kevin and I are going to talk primarily Big Ten sports, actually all Big Ten sports. This is basketball season, Kevin, and I love conference basketball. I could do without the 12 cupcake games or the 13 cupcake games, however many they want to play. But it is Big Ten. We're going to talk primarily today Big Ten basketball. But the football season ended. I want to throw it back to you. I know you do some things outside of the show. But when you look at the Big Ten this year, Kevin, I'm already mixing you up with all the other things I do. But, Kevin, the big thing was Penn State being left out of the national championship game. Penn State had that big win over Ohio State. What were your overall thoughts of the Big Ten football season this year? You had teams ranked in the top 10. You had teams in the national playoff picture. Is Big Ten football back?
I think so. I mean, ultimately, I always go back to this with sports, and you think of top teams in any sport, no matter what sport it is, no matter what level. If you have a competent head coach, you can win a title no matter what sport, what level it is. But if you have a great head coach, you have a head coach, obviously collegiate or in the pros, who's making personnel decisions. If you've got a coach leading your team that has an influence on the players in that regard, and you've got someone who can recruit, we'll stick with the college level at this point, but you look at these Big Ten teams now at the top of the conference, like Ohio State obviously has Urban Meyer, Penn State with James Franklin. He is becoming an elite coach if he is not already one. And then Wisconsin and Michigan, Paul Chryst has basically learned his ways at Wisconsin for a while, had a little year-long pit stop, and then went back to Wisconsin, and he's got that team basically rolling. It seems like if Wisconsin doesn't have the overly dominating offensive line or running game that they had a few years ago, that's okay because their defense is top 5 in the country, and no matter what stat you look at. So Paul Chryst has Wisconsin rolling. They finished 9th, and then Michigan, obviously, with Jim Harbaugh. People know about Jim Harbaugh, so there's no need to discuss that. He can obviously recruit. He can build a program anywhere, and he's certainly doing that in Michigan. So, you look at the Big Ten, you look at the AP Top 25, the final poll, and Ohio State at 6, Penn State 7, Wisconsin 9, Michigan 10. That's 4 teams in the top 10. Obviously, none in the top 5 finishing there. Ohio State made the college football playoff, so basically every year you're going to get one of these top Big Ten teams in there, no matter who it is, because of these coaches and the recruits that they get. I think if you look at an eye test of these teams, it's easy to tell that they can basically play with anyone. So you're going to get a Big Ten team in the college football playoff every single year, in my opinion. It's just a matter of which one or, potentially 2. I think that's certainly not an impossible thing in college football, especially with how big these programs are, that Ohio State, Penn State, Wisconsin, and Michigan, especially those 4, are becoming. Outside of that, the Big Ten didn't have a primary team that's, contending, but most conferences can't count 4 teams as a legitimate national title contender. So if you've got 4 in the top 10, I would most certainly say that the conference is back. Absolutely.
Yeah, I'll tell you, Kevin, the surprise, though, is Penn State. When James Franklin got hired, to be honest, I wasn't sure if that was the right hire. I was like, is this the right hire for Penn State? Is this a guy that can come in and take over what's going on in Happy Valley? And he's proven everybody wrong. And some people may agree or disagree with the way that he approaches things, but you got to look at the results. The results are there. And what Paul Chryst did at Wisconsin this year is overly exceeding expectations that I ever thought. I know you and I had you on one of the other radio shows that I do, and I talked about Wisconsin, that at the end of the year, they had this run, and they just exceeded every expectation that I had for this team's record. I thought they would be maybe a game or 2 over 500, maybe pushing the 8, 9, 10 mark, maybe. I was just so uncertain because the funny thing is, Kevin, there's a lot of kids coming back on that team. That's a young team. They're not senior heavy. They've got some seniors that are leaving, but this is a team, the core is there. That offensive line, to me, was a big question mark for Wisconsin. They proved that they're going to get better, and that is the MO of Paul Chryst. You're going to see a dominating offensive line at some point. Like you said, it wasn't this year, but that team is going to get dominated. He's going to have, at some point, he's going to have the best offensive line in the Big Ten, and he's going to have a running back that's going to be one of the best in the nation. It's just a matter of time for him to get that in there. So, to me, seeing what he did with what he had this year, oh my. It really makes me, as a Badger fan, excited about the future with Paul Chryst. So, you got 2 teams in Wisconsin, Penn State, Kevin, that came out of nowhere. So my question to you is, you got these 4 teams, because Penn State's going to probably be near the top again next year. Does having those 4 teams top-heavy in the Big Ten help the other teams that are kind of mediocre when it comes to recruiting? I know they're all going after the same kids, but on the recruiting trail, let's say you now have an Indiana trying to recruit another kid maybe from another conference. Does the success of the Big Ten overall help the other teams that are mediocre land better recruits?
I think so, because I think that if you're a kid, even you don't have to say Texas, but if you're a recruit in, say, even Oklahoma, And so you're close to the middle part of the country, and Nebraska's knocking on your door. And you look at the Big 12, and who do you have? You know, you've got Oklahoma. They're going to be a front runner next year. It's funny next year because all of the big brands are going to be dominant next year. The top 6 or 7 teams are all these, you know, Alabama, USC, Oklahoma, Ohio State, all these big names are going to be dominant next year. So if you're a fan of the little guy, it's not going to be your cup of tea once the college football playoff / last weekend rolls around. But again, going back to a recruit in the middle of the country, if you're looking and you see the Big Ten and the success that they have, you know, all a Big Ten coach has to do to, I think, entice you over a Big 12 coach or even the SEC outside of Alabama. That's really been a one-team conference recently. So if you're a Big Ten follower and you see these 4 teams finishing in the top 10, you see the success. You know, they didn't have as much success as they wanted in the bowl season, but regardless, these top 4 teams finished in the top 10. And so all you have to do is be one of the top teams in the Big Ten. So Nebraska, for instance, if they have one good year, if they find a special running back and a quarterback that can do some things and a defense that's average, and they put together 10, 11 wins, they're going to be right there in the top 10 because they're going to be amongst these other great teams with great coaches in the Big Ten. And so you can sell a kid that, hey, all you have to do is come, and we're going to recruit a couple other, you know, big-time guys, so guys that maybe get left out of the Alabamas, the Clemsons, the Ohio States, these 3 stars, maybe some 4 stars that get left behind because they don't want to sit in the depth chart, and they go to a Nebraska, they go to an Indiana, they go to wherever. And all you have to do is have 1 year where you win 10, 11 games. You pop up in the Big Ten championship game. No matter who you meet, it's going to be a great team. And right there, you're in the college football playoff. So I don't think it hurts at all to have these complete upper echelon teams like the Big 4 that we've mentioned. But even if you're a middle-of-the-road guy, middle-of-the-road recruit, a 3-star recruit, like I said, who gets left out of the Alabama, LSU talks, if you're a kid down south, you know, you don't want to go to Miami. They're not exactly on the rise. You know, if a Nebraska comes calling, all they have to say is that, hey, we're in the Big Ten. We just need 1 year, 2 years. We're going to get these recruits going, and we just need 1 year where we make the Big Ten championship game. And then from there, you win a game, you're in the college football playoff. So being a successful conference helps you whether you're at the top, bottom, or in the middle, in my opinion.
Definitely does. Well, I know this is go big or go home. I am old man Troy. I am talking with the youngster kid Cunny. Time to move on to the fun part. It is now basketball. It's basketball, Kevin. And when you look at the top 25, Big Ten, maybe not as dominant that they have been in years past, because right now the highest-ranked team is Wisconsin at 17, Purdue coming in at 21, Maryland at 25, and then it's still, like, I have to, like, pinch myself, Kevin. Northwestern received votes. And if you count the teams, Northwestern would be ranked 30th. But Northwestern getting votes. You're not seeing the likes of a Michigan State, the likes of Ohio State, the likes of a Michigan, even Indiana. You're seeing Wisconsin, who many think is a team that could contend and go back to the Final Four. Purdue, they're a team that have had their moments in Big Ten basketball. Maryland, it is one of those things where you and I talked about it before. They are leading the Big Ten, but really, who have they beaten? They're ranked 25th. But where's the Michigan States, Kevin? Where's the Michigan, the Indianas, the Illinois, the Iowas? They're all sitting near the bottom. It's kind of a crazy start, in my opinion, to this Big Ten year. What are your initial thoughts? We're about 5-6 games in the conference play, depending on what team you look at. But it looks kind of weird at the top of the Big Ten, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, you know, you look at the Big Ten standings, and you have Maryland and then Wisconsin, and so it's like, okay, that makes sense. Michigan State at 4, Purdue at 5. Those teams are obviously typically good, and so they're at the top. Like you said, though, Northwestern 4-2 in the conference through 6 games, 15-4 overall. Those are obviously good numbers. If the NCAA tournament were to begin tomorrow, like you said, this team would be ranked 30th, so they would be roughly an 8th seed, I guess, following that little S curve that the NCAA tournament works by. But so it's a 15-4 team who's 4-2 in the Big Ten, and at this point it looks great. But at the same time, you look at their schedule, and you're 15-4. You lost to Butler, Notre Dame, obviously two good teams, and then you lose at Michigan State, which again I think is a quality loss. But then they lost at home to Minnesota. So the losses are fine. I guess for an 8 seed, it kind of correlates in my opinion. But you look at the wins, and that's kind of where 15-4 is I think a pretty strong record. But the wins, you look at Northwestern's schedule, and they beat Texas in late November, and then that's kind of it as far as quality wins go. You have a lot of Bryant's and Wake Forest and DePaul's and New Orleans and Chicago State and IUPUI, Houston Baptist. So that's why, 15-4, third in the Big Ten at this point, but that's why they're not even in the top 10 or top 25 is because of, you look at their losses and they're two quality teams, but you look at the wins and they're just not there. Like you mentioned, we talk about with Maryland, we'll get to that. But so, yeah, I think the top dogs in the Big Ten are kind of near the top, but like you mentioned, those teams near the bottom, the Michigans, you expected Michigan State to kind of start off hotter this year than they have. So you're looking at Indiana. They initially, the preseason poll, they're in the top 20 for sure. I forgot exactly where it was, but they were hunched around the 10-15 mark for a while there, but then they just went on a huge losing streak. So, yeah, they're 2-3 in conference. So, essentially, the top of the Big Ten is expected outside of Northwestern, but you expected some of these teams like Indiana and Michigan to be a little better than they are.
Yeah, well, the media rankings had Northwestern at 11, and being up at number 3, I want to touch on this just a little bit because you look at Northwestern, and it's a great story, right? 15-4. Wow, we're 15-4. We're almost to that magical 20 wins, and I don't think that's magical anymore for the NCAA. But again, they didn't beat anybody. And so you Northwestern fans, if you're listening, I'm sorry. You can dislike the old man. But you didn't beat anybody. You're 4-2, 6 games into the season. Let's see how this plays out. I don't see Northwestern, Kevin, being third at the end of the season. I see them maybe being in that 7, 8, 9 range somewhere. And I see some of these teams near the bottom, the Indianas, the Michigans, the Ohio States, vaulting up a little bit because they're only going to get a little bit better. I guess my biggest disappointment right now is Indiana. The media had them ranked third in the preseason poll in the Big Ten. So what has went on in Indiana, Kevin? They're 2-3, 12-6 overall. I'm not so worried about the overall record. But I'm looking at a 2-3 Big Ten start. I know you can say the Big Ten, maybe there's not that dominant team this year. There's not that top 5 team, and maybe it's more parity in the Big Ten. But to be where they're at right now, near the bottom of the conference, kind of surprising to me.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think you hit it on the head that I don't think there is a legitimate national title contender in the Big Ten. I'm just throwing that out there. Episode 1, that I fully don't expect a Big Ten team to win a national title. I don't expect one to get to the title game. I don't expect one to get to the Final Four. I think if one makes the Elite Eight, I think that makes sense in my opinion. If you got 2, I think if you're a Big Ten fan and you get 2 in the Elite Eight at this point, you're looking at how these teams are actually performing against quality competition. And, yeah, I'd be surprised if they got 2 in the Elite Eight. I'd be surprised if they got 1 in the Final Four. I'm not going to have 1 in the Final Four. I know that. So, again, with Indiana, though, you mentioned the overall record, whatever. You look at their losses, Louisville, Wisconsin, at Maryland, Butler. So there are certainly some quality losses in there. You can't really fault the team at that, but they also lost to Fort Wayne. They lost to Nebraska. Those are the ones that you have to scratch your head at. and you look at their victories, and it's unbelievable when you look at Indiana's schedule. If you just pop up Indiana's schedule and you see the first game of the year, they scored 103 points. It went to overtime, but they scored 103 on Kansas to open the season. So it got everyone excited. Then their fourth game of the year, they lose to Fort Wayne, like I mentioned, and then a couple games later, they come back and beat North Carolina by 9 points. So it's like, okay, they had one terrible slip-up to a team that I've never heard of. So that's, it's whatever. It's early in the year, fine. You beat Kansas, you beat North Carolina, that's certainly something. But then, again, over these last 6 games, they're 2-4. They beat Illinois, they beat Rutgers. And so, again, that's what it comes down to is they're playing quality teams like Louisville, Wisconsin, Maryland, but they're not picking up victories. So Indiana the last few years, to me, they're always an exciting watch. They always have guards who can shoot. They always have guards who can drive. They've got plenty of guards. Their issue in the past couple of years, in my opinion, has been down low. And, to me, they just need that big guy that they can go to. Thomas Bryant, he's averaging 11 and 6. That's, fine and dandy, but he obviously has to do more for this team. The guards and the wings obviously have to excel for this team to excel, and at this point, they're just not. They're playing teams who are, I think, on their caliber of skill level, like a Wisconsin. I don't think Indiana's terribly mismatched in those type of matchups with Wisconsin and Maryland and the top teams in the Big Ten, but they're just not performing at this point.
Yeah, you bring up Maryland, so let's jump right to the top. Maryland, first in the conference, 4-1. Preseason media had them at 6, and I kind of think that's where you may see them end up should these teams figure out what's going on. I looked across the conference, Kevin, and there's some good young players in the conference, but like you said, there's no dominant team. And you look at the middle of this conference right now, and you start with Northwestern with 2 losses already, and they're in 3rd place. So you got 2 losses in 3rd place, and then you have to go all the way down, and even Michigan is 2-3. So you've got this big road jam of teams that are anywhere from 2-3 to 4-2, and I see it that way. And I could see Wisconsin slipping up. I could see the Marylands slipping up because my big concern with Maryland, okay, they're ranked 25th, and they do have a tradition of good basketball at Maryland, but they really didn't beat anybody. They're 4-1 in the Big Ten, and who's their big win against? Michigan? And I don't think Michigan's a dominant team. So when I look at the 4 conference wins for Maryland, okay, you can be excited, kind of like the Northwestern. You're at the top of the conference. You're 4-1. But I think it's going to be a common theme as we do this show every week, Kevin. There's no really big wins that are out there to be had for the committee to go, ooh, wow, even if you beat Wisconsin, I don't think that this is a Wisconsin team, like you said, that is going to be the dominant team in the country. I mean, they started ranked high, but now they're down to 17. And there's a reason for that. And I think there's a reason you see the Big Ten teams near the bottom of the top 20, top 25, because I don't think any one of these teams can control and be dominant. They can on any given day. Any team can be. But to sustain an NCAA tournament run, I totally agree with you. Now, can teams flip this around and get dominant over the course of time? Well, sure, that can happen. But when I look at the conference, they're so young. There's a lot of good young players, which to me brings inconsistency, and that's what I think we're seeing right now early in the season. That's why you see teams at 2-3 or 3-2 or 3-3, because of that inconsistency of the young players. Now, will these players stay and build the program? Wisconsin's usually very good for it, but you even look at Nigel Hayes right now. He's not having a stellar year. I think he's around 13 points a game. Yeah, I guess in college that's okay, but you would expect a Nigel Hayes to maybe be up around 20 points a game. But going back to Maryland, Kevin, sitting at 4-1 on top of the Big Ten early on, our first show, heck, in 2 weeks we could be talking about Maryland being in 3rd or 4th place. What are your quick thoughts on Maryland?
I think they're a good team. I think that 16-2 doesn't, advertise them as how they are, and that's exactly what the committee thinks. You look at these rankings, and like you said, it's where are the big wins going to come? Because even if the NCAA tournament ended or started tomorrow, Wisconsin's a 5 seed, number 17. They're the number 1 5 seed. So, again, where are your big wins going to come from? There's not necessarily any to be had. Exactly like you said, Purdue at this point is a 6 seed. Maryland would be a 7. So these teams right now, they have some lofty records, and that can be had because of the teams they beat. Like you kind of called it to start the show, the cupcake, extra 12 games to start the year. I personally love them because you get to see these matchups where like an Indiana plays a North Carolina or a Kansas, and so you see these big teams from big conferences play against each other, and it's all great and high scoring. And then, conference play rolls around, and you realize exactly what Indiana is, and it's kind of a worse version of what they were, a year ago, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, 4 years ago. They've got some solid guards, but they're not spectacular, and then they're just lacking the size down low. And with Maryland, again, last year was certainly Maryland's year to contend in many people's eyes because that's when they had that enormous load of talent. Melo Trimble's still their top guy, and he's going to continue to be their top guy with the ball in his hands constantly. So they've got a profound guard that can go into a tournament game, and it's a one-and-done system. So you just have to have one good game. You're going to win. But like you mentioned, you have to sustain that success. And so can a one-man show with some solid talent around him, a 7-1 big guy in McCall Sikovsky, I probably butchered that name, but you look at Maryland and just their overall talent, and it's just Melo Trimble and some guys who are decent, but that's not going to win you 4, 5, 6 games to win a national title come postseason time. So 16-2, Maryland, obviously be happy with yourself, but you're ranked 25th right now in the country for a reason. And again, you look at the schedule and their best win, you probably have to go to the second game of the season when they went and beat Georgetown on the road. Georgetown's not ranked. That's their best win of the year right now. There's no other team that's even close. You start listing off these wins that they've had: American, St. Mary's, Towson, Stony Brook, Howard, St. Peter's, Jacksonville State. And then you look at the Big Ten wins that Maryland's had: Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, who's disappointed. So these teams, they beat Illinois twice, actually. They're done with playing Illinois. That's how they've gotten 2 wins so far in the Big Ten. So, again, just overall, this Maryland team, it's great that you're on top of the conference, but you're ranked 25th because where are the big wins to be had? That's the question going forward. Some teams have to separate themselves, and I'm just not sure exactly which teams those are. I personally have one favorite that we haven't talked about yet, but those big wins are to be had. But the question is, where are they?
Yeah, exactly. You are listening to Go Big or Go Home with the old man Troy and the youngster kid Cunny. We've been a little negative on the Big Ten right now, Kevin. So maybe a little positive. And you look at some of these teams. I talk about these cupcake games, and you mentioned where the wins come from, and you play an American, and, well, I guess I shouldn't make fun of Fort Wayne, should I? They ended up beating an Indiana team. But a lot of these, pre-scheduled games are against teams to kind of inflate that record. But then when it comes to rankings, and that's where it's rolling out now when you're in the conference. But there are some good games. And I know that, when you have these power conferences playing against each other, like the ACC Big Ten Challenge, I love that. I love that challenge. I love seeing those two conferences battle it out. I wish there'd be more of that. But there's a team, Michigan State, Kevin, 12-7. You look at it, they're 12-7. What's wrong with Michigan State? I don't think there's a darn thing wrong with Michigan State because of those 7 losses, you've got a loss to Arizona, you've got a loss to Kentucky, Duke, Baylor. That's 4 top 20 teams, and actually you've got a Kentucky team that's 5th, Baylor's 6th. I don't think there's anything wrong with Michigan State, and Tom Izzo may be one of those coaches that's not afraid to schedule dominant teams in what I call the preseason, which is those cupcake games. You'll find Michigan State having some of those value games, and a 12-7 record. Tom Izzo's probably not fretting right now when you look overall at the Big Ten. Sitting at 4-2 may be a little bit disappointing for him because those two losses, Kevin, Penn State and Ohio State. So probably you saw a little fiery Tom Izzo in practice after those losses. But I don't think he's fretting anywhere anytime soon, knowing where the level of competition is in the Big Ten this year, knowing that they can probably run a big string of wins here in the Big Ten if this team plays up to capabilities. But I think Michigan State is probably one of the best 12-7 teams in the country. What are your thoughts?
Oh, absolutely. There's no question. I mean, I personally don't know all the 12-7 teams off the top of my head, but you've got to imagine that looking at this roster, and not to say that the roster is dominant by any means, but it's certainly got some talent. It's just a matter of finding the cohesion, and you've got Miles Bridges who can basically do everything. He's been sensational, and they're basically anytime Michigan State plays a televised game, all you have to do is look at the tweets, and you look under Miles Bridges, you search that into Twitter, and it's like, why is this guy not getting the ball more? That's basically what everyone's saying. He's a 6'7" small forward, essentially, who can shoot from three. He shoots 41% from three, averaging 15 a game, but that's as a freshman. And like you mentioned, he's got these games in Michigan State schedule. You mentioned the four juggernauts that they played: Arizona, Kentucky, Baylor, Duke. Those are all four that, if any of them made the Final Four, you're not surprised whatsoever. So this team's played a gauntlet to start the season. That's where these losses have piled up. But so Miles Bridges needs to get the ball more. That's front and center. That's just going to take time, though. He's a talented freshman, and he's played halfway through his first year in college basketball. And so whether he stays another year or not, that's to be determined. But Tom Izzo, Michigan State, they always get great down the stretch, and that's where this Michigan State team becomes dangerous. And so if Bridges finds his way into the team and Tom Izzo gets this thing rolling, Michigan State's absolutely dangerous. Like you mentioned, at 12-7. I mean, you look at the schedule, and after those first 8 games, they're 4-4, and people are wondering, okay, is this team, a typical Tom Izzo team where they start slow but then, pick up the pace? And they pick up 3 straight wins after the Duke loss, their 8th game of the season, but then they lost to Northeastern, and that's where people started kind of fretting. Like, okay, why is Michigan State losing to Northeastern? If this team's going to turn it on, they shouldn't lose to teams like that. So after that game, they win 4 straight. Everything's great. But then, like you mentioned, they lost to Penn State and Ohio State recently. So, again, it's kind of inconsistencies. It's, like you mentioned, the conference as a whole is just young, and Michigan State's best player is a freshman. And so it's just going to take time to build a unit, to build a team, for Tom Izzo to figure things out, for the team to figure out how to play within Izzo's system, just everything that, deals with building a team. You look at the NBA and LeBron James, if he goes immediately to Miami, it doesn't automatically work season 1. It takes a year to get everything gelled, everything together. Goes to Cleveland, it takes a year to get everything together, to get everything in place, to figure out which guys play well with each other, where guys want the ball in certain situations, what to call after timeouts to utilize your new guys. It just takes time. And so Tom Izzo's teams are notorious for starting off a little slower than you expect. But toward the end of the year, if this team rolls off 10 straight going into the NCAA tournament, and they pick up a high seed that people didn't expect because of their overall record, if they have 10 losses, but it's against teams that are just juggernauts, that's okay, because you have this team that will come together. It's just what Tom Izzo does. So seeing this Michigan State team in the postseason is never a good thing. And, again, their best players are freshmen. He's only going to get better as the season goes along.
Yeah, I agree. And that's why, again, you look at the inconsistencies that I've seen in the Big Ten, and there's another team right below Michigan State that I think is a very good team. It's the team that's ranked 21st, and this is a Purdue team. It's like I look at Purdue, Kevin, I watch Purdue, and I see Purdue like, oh my, this is a good team. But then they turn around and they lose to Minnesota. So I'm, again, looking at this inconsistency, but I like Purdue. I like Purdue being near the top at the end of the Big Ten season, but I can't, like, if I'm a gambling man, put my money on them because I look at their 2 losses in the conference. They beat Wisconsin, who's supposed to be the number 1 team in the conference. They beat them. But then they turn around and they lose to Iowa and Minnesota. So what is Purdue, Kevin? I mean, are they just the inconsistent team we're talking about across the Big Ten, or are they that dominant team that could pull off a win or 2 in the Big Ten or in the national tournament?
I think this is the team that I mentioned earlier that we haven't talked about yet that I like a lot. It's this Purdue team. Again, you mentioned the 2 recent losses, and Minnesota, that was an overtime game, so it could have went either way. In basketball, you're going to have close games. This one went to overtime. If they make 1 free throw here and there, 1 basket somewhere during regulation, they can win the game, and it's nothing we even think about. It's just a close win over Minnesota. So it just is what it is. And then at Iowa, you lose by 5. It's a road game. It's 5 points. Can you really kill them for it? I don't necessarily kill them for it. But, again, if you're a legitimate top 15, top 10 team who is looking to make a Final Four, no, you don't lose to Iowa. No, you don't lose to Minnesota. So I absolutely get it. But, again, there are other 2 losses. They've only got 4. Those are the 2 in the Big Ten. Obviously not what you want to see at this point early on in the Big Ten season. That's why we're talking about the struggles and the inconsistencies and the youth of the conference, and why we're being so negative is because no team has stood out and impressed us yet. But the other 2 losses for Purdue at Louisville and Villanova. So you can't necessarily fault them on that. They beat Notre Dame earlier this season. That's certainly a quality win. But so it's just, again, you look at the top teams that these top teams in the Big Ten are beating across the country, and they're just not really anywhere to be had outside of Indiana's magical, it seems like, Kansas victory and North Carolina victory. It seems like no Big Ten team has that signature win to say, hey, you know what, we might have stumbled in the Big Ten to start once or twice, but we belong in the top 10, we belong in the top 15. No team has made that signature win to say that we belong, and that's exactly what the voters are doing. 3 teams in the top 25 is fine if you're the Big Ten. You typically have more. But being 17, with Wisconsin being 17, it's crazy to take a look at the Big Ten standings and the rankings to this point, the top 25, and the Big Ten, who has had teams, at least 1, 2, it seems like 3 teams that legitimately can make a Final Four year in, year out, and there's not one, again, that we've mentioned that I would put my money on to make the Final Four. There's not one I would put my money on to make the Elite Eight at this point, but Purdue is the one team that I like because of their size inside. It's just Caleb Swanigan has 4 20-20 games so far in college basketball, 20-point, 20-rebound games. He's got 4 of them, and the entire country outside of Swanigan also has 4 20-20 games so far this season. So the Boilermakers have something inside with Swanigan, and Isaac Haas is also a monster. He's only averaging 13 and 5, and being a 7'2" guy, averaging 5 rebounds, I think that's unacceptable. But he's a 7'2" guy playing alongside Swanigan in the post that gives Purdue an advantage over any team that they play, whether it's a Kentucky, a Kansas, a Duke. They've got the size to match up with absolutely anybody. It's just a matter of the guards coming to play on a consistent basis. So I like Purdue a lot, but like you mentioned, they've got to get victories over good teams, and they can't lose to teams like Iowa and Minnesota, as the Big Ten season progresses.
I like Swanigan. He's averaging 18 points, Kevin, 12 rebounds, almost 13 rebounds a game. 18 and 13. So I'll call it 18 and 13 because it's 12.6. I mean, this is a guy that and he's at Purdue, so he's probably not getting the national attention that he probably deserves. He's just fun to watch. He's very well stamping his mark right now to be Big Ten Player of the Year. He is doing a lot of things, and I do like Purdue. They've already knocked off Wisconsin. It's that inconsistency, but I like Purdue. And let's talk now a little bit about this Wisconsin team. Everybody's saying they're the number one team in the Big Ten, but again, the same thing with Wisconsin. Now they only have 3 losses, but here's the thing, Kevin. You're at 14-3, ranked 17. 14-3, ranked 17. So I'm not sure, and I'm a Wisconsin guy. I am a diehard Badger fan, but I'm not really sure how good they are. They have the makings, the Bronson King, the Nigel Hayes, Ethan Happ. There's your big 3, Kevin, but they haven't impressed me, if that makes any sense to you. They're 14-3, but I've not been impressed. What are your overall thoughts early of Wisconsin? This is a team, when you look at the conference, with those 3, the big 3 is what I'll call them, with Happ, Koenig, and Hayes, that, to be honest, if they were all playing on top of their game, that could be that team that's supposedly supposed to be dominant. And I think that's where a lot of media thought they'd be. But they're not dominating in my mind. Maybe I'm wrong.
Well, I don't think you're wrong at all, because it's exactly what the voters are thinking at this point, putting them at 17. It's like where you see the talent, and I guess I'll start with that. You see the talent, and I guess this is where the positivity from the Big Ten comes from, is you see the talent that is on these teams, if just based on the eye test, which I'd love to do. You can look at a box score and see Wisconsin beating Tennessee by 12, and it's a convincing victory. That's wonderful. But at the same time, if you watch the game, and I didn't watch this Wisconsin-Tennessee game, I'm just using it as an example, but Wisconsin could have trailed at half, and they could have trailed with 4 minutes left in the game, and they made a big spurt, and then free throws at the end of the game vaulted to a 12-point victory. So you look at the schedule, and it can tell you some things. It can tell you a final score. It can tell you who played well in terms of percentages, who shot well from the field, which team had more free throws, got to the line, which team fouled more, which team turned it over more. But ultimately, the eye test to me is something that you have to go by if you really want to judge these teams. And again, you brought up Wisconsin's big 3 in Koenig, Hayes, and Happ. And if those 3 are on top of their game, and that team rolls into March with a few victories under its belt, going into the NCAA tournament, say they win the Big Ten tournament, and they've got 6-7 losses to teams like Purdue and North Carolina and Creighton, who are their 3 losses at this point. So they're all 3, very legitimate teams in my opinion. Purdue's been a little inconsistent in the Big Ten. We mentioned that. But Wisconsin doesn't have a bad loss. And so any team where you can think, okay, Wisconsin could flip at Marquette. That's always a rivalry game, and Marquette's got talent. But Wisconsin put up 93 points in that game. Wisconsin beat a Tennessee team. Wisconsin beat a Georgetown team. Wisconsin beat Oklahoma, who's certainly down this year. So that's not an extremely quality win. But they also beat Syracuse. So they're beating teams. They went to Indiana and won. They beat Ohio State. They scored 89 points in that game. So this team, I think, when clicking, they can play with up-paced teams like a Marquette. Ohio State kind of wants to get up and down every so often. Indiana. Wisconsin's putting up numbers. They're beating quality teams. They just don't have that signature victory yet. You can say at Indiana is their best win at this point, or Syracuse at home. So again, it just is a matter of playing teams down the road that you can look at and qualify as a significant victory. But in the Big Ten, it's just yet to be had because these teams are young, like we've mentioned over and over, and so the inconsistencies are there. When comparing this conference to teams like Butler and Louisville and Florida State and North Carolina and Creighton, Baylor, Kentucky, Gonzaga, UCLA, the list goes on and on. Duke, even at 18, I mean, if you look at that team, eye test-wise, the talent is certainly there. So it's not to say that Virginia at 16 or Arizona at 14 or Purdue at 21, Wisconsin at 17, that they don't have the talent. It's just that these other teams are beating up on lower teams and showing their talent and being more consistent. That's why those teams are at the top of the rankings, and that's why Wisconsin, even at 14-3, they just don't have that signature win that a Florida State, North Carolina, Baylor, Kentucky that they've picked up. So it's still early in the year. We're talking about the Big Ten, and no team is ranked higher than 17th, but let the Big Ten season play out. Let the coaches do their thing and make these rosters play together and learn their playing styles. And yes, Maryland in a one-game format, with Melo Trimble leading the charge, can absolutely knock off, almost any team in the country, in my opinion. Wisconsin can do the same with their Big Three. Michigan State, they've got the talent. Tom Izzo will have this team playing solid at the end of the year. There's no question about it. They're not a team you ever want to play in March. Purdue's got two monsters inside. So Indiana's got great guards. This conference is littered with talent. It's just hasn't been consistent yet compared to the other teams in the country. That's why they're ranked a little lower. But we're 5-6 games into the Big Ten season, so let it play out. Let these young rosters develop. And eventually come tournament time, when playing against top teams from other conferences, that's when the Big Ten will get better and you'll get better showings. And so while a Final Four championship team might not be there, you don't want to play a Maryland, Wisconsin, Purdue, Michigan State, Indiana in the tournament. They're not teams that you look forward to seeing.
Well, it's funny, Kevin, you bring up watching these kids grow. It was, being the old guy that I am. In the old days, when we walked to school one way in a snowstorm and up the hill and all that good stuff, you said, yeah, watch these teams develop and watch them develop over the years. And now it's let's watch these kids develop over months. Like, we're expecting development within the same year. We're not saying, hey, wait till next year. You're saying, let's watch these kids develop in 1 year. Do you think it's unfair to put that much pressure on these young kids, Kevin? Because in the past, it's been, okay, I'm going to recruit. I'm going to let these young kids maybe sit on the bench for a little bit, develop, and then next year and the year after. But now with the opportunity to go to the big show, the NBA, we're expecting development from young freshmen and sophomores within a matter of months and within the season. Is it unfair?
Ultimately, I mean, when you look across college basketball and the teams that develop their guys over years, like you're saying, you get those Wisconsin runs where, you can go to back-to-back Final Fours and beat undefeated Kentucky teams once you get these young kids developed. And so if you're expecting a true freshman in Miles Bridges to completely get his act together and Tom Izzo to completely figure him out and to gel him within his team, which a team, to me, this Michigan State team this year doesn't have the talent that they've had in the last couple of years. Bridges is certainly one of those talents. But so I guess to answer your question, is it unfair? I don't think it is if you're picking up guys like Bridges and, 7-footers that are impactful in the paint. They will always conquer in college basketball because of just the lesser talent. And so is it unfair to ask Bridges to carry a Michigan State team to a Final Four year one by himself? Yeah. If you're Kentucky and you're Duke and you're reloading like that, year in, year out with McDonald's All-Americans all over the place, no, it's not crazy to expect those teams to do that on a year-to-year basis and to lose 3 guys, 4 guys to the NBA, have 3 guys drafted in the top 15, like Kentucky's done in the past, and to just reload and make another Final Four. I don't think it's unrealistic because you're getting all the top guys to go to one place. And so it's just talent prevails in the end. A Tom Izzo team, coached up through the years and building up an older team can absolutely take down a Kentucky team like Wisconsin did a couple years ago. So it's not impossible to have these kids play at a high level, but like you said, it takes years if you don't have the constant 4-star, 5-star kids coming in year to year. So that's why I said, and that's why I think we both agree to this point, that the Big Ten doesn't have a championship contender. They don't have, necessarily a surefire Final Four contender, but at this point. But in 2 years, yeah, these kids will grow up if they don't leave for the NBA like a Bridges eventually will. these teams will take these 3-star and 4-star recruits and have a run like Wisconsin did. And so, yeah, you will have that uptick in the Big Ten. But at the same time, right now, they're just young, and none of these teams are extraordinarily talented. Purdue's got an unbelievable front court that will match any front court in the country. That's today. That's now. But so it's just a matter of these kids growing up, and is it impossible for them to grow within a year? If you don't have the, surefire NBA kids coming in year after year, yeah, it's impossible. You shouldn't expect that from any of these teams. But if you give them 2 years, 3 years to build a culture like Wisconsin did most recently and to make back-to-back Final Fours, that's what can happen. It just hasn't been seen in the Big Ten to this point yet. Give it a year, 2 years for some of these teams, and we'll see them back on top of the country again. It's just a matter of time. Right now, it's about these groups being cohesive and getting an identity at this point. And so that's why I think the Big Ten right now doesn't have that top team, but they will in a year or two. I don't think this is necessarily a tragic year for the Big Ten. They just haven't met expectations at the start of the season. Again, come postseason time, there are 4 or 5 teams that if you're in the NCAA tournament, you absolutely don't want to see. There's no question about that.
Yeah, and I think I look at this Big Ten this year, and it's not going to be watered down in the national tournament, Kevin. I'm not sure how deep the selection committee is going to go. Again, we're 5 games in, so things can change in a month. But what I'm looking at, and you can agree or disagree with me, but what I'm looking at, as I talked about in the beginning of the show, I see a logjam from like 3 to 10, where teams are going to be hovering at or above a game or two above 500, and I think we're going to see that all year. I think what we've seen in the first 5 games of the conference is pretty much what we're going to see from here on out. I don't know who's going to separate. I mean, there's teams. There's the 3 teams that we talked about. I don't think Maryland's going to separate, Kevin. There's something about Maryland. I know they're 16-2. I know they're 4-1, and people will get on me. But I don't think I see them separating. The teams I think that could, Wisconsin, because they've got the big 3. Purdue, like you mentioned, with the front court, and Michigan State. I think those are 3 teams that you could see vault and separate. So if you take that group of 3, that's fine, but now you've got 11 other teams. And I definitely, when you look at the bottom, though, Kevin, you got Rutgers at 0-6. I don't know if they'll win a conference game. You've got the likes of a Minnesota who's off to a 3-3 start, but I see a conglomerate of teams that are going to be hovering around 500, maybe 2-3 games above 500, if that. And I don't think it's going to be good enough at the end of the year to get into the big show. I only think you might see maybe up to 5 teams, Kevin, in the national tournament, which would be a very low number for the Big Ten. But I think that's in the reality, or, do you think the number will be different? But when I look at it, and I look at teams, you got 3 in the top 25 right now, Northwestern receiving votes. There's no Michigan State in there right now. I think you can put Michigan State in there, and maybe one of these other teams will vault up to 4 or 5 and slide in as a 10 seed in the NCAA tournament. But I'm finding it hard. If the tournament started today, I'm finding it hard to even put 5 in the tournament. What about you?
I think right now you can definitely get 5. I think right now that Maryland, Wisconsin, Northwestern, like you said, they're receiving votes, so they're a 7-8 seed at this point. Maryland, Wisconsin, Northwestern, Michigan State, Purdue, I think those right now are locks. There's 5. But, yeah, then it gets interesting with Penn State at 11-7 overall. Nebraska 9-8, obviously not. Minnesota at 15-4. I think Minnesota at 15-4 would get in. But, yeah, having a 500 Big Ten record this year isn't something to necessarily say, okay, we're a 21-10 team. We went 500 in the Big Ten. We got to the second round of the Big Ten tournament. They're obviously a quality team. They're a 9 seed. They're a 10 seed. Get them in there. Absolutely. The Big Ten's great. But this year, like you mentioned, if you're 20-10, 21-10, you get to the second round, and, after you beat a Rutgers or you beat a Michigan or an Ohio State team who's been down, or an Illinois or an Iowa, that's not a quality victory. And then you lose in the second round of the Big Ten tournament, and you're sitting there with a 500 Big Ten record this year. Is that going to beat out other conference teams, other big conference teams? The answer this year, the answer is no. Past years, absolutely, the answer is yes. A 21-10 Minnesota team who goes 7-7, 8-8 in the Big Ten, that's all fine and dandy. You're making the tournament. This year, that's when questions arise. That's when bid stealers come in from other, small conference tournaments. That's where other leagues, the Pac-12 has certainly a slew of good teams. The ACC is absolutely loaded. Florida State plays 6 straight ranked teams in the ACC. They're in ACC play, and they're playing 6 straight ranked teams this year. It's incredible. And so the Big Ten doesn't have that this year. So if an ACC team goes 21-10 with a 500 record, they're getting in over a Big Ten team with the same exact record. That's just reality this year. So, yeah, Big Ten, if they get 5 in the tournament, that doesn't surprise me. Indiana's a team I think can absolutely they have the talent to make a little bit of a run toward the end of the year and get themselves comfortably in, whether it's a 7 seed, 8 seed, something like that. Minnesota at 15-4, is another team. Northwestern right now is in. Can they keep it up? If Northwestern drops, who is that team to pick it up? So I think one of these middle-of-the-road teams will. It's just a matter of who. But, yeah, you're looking at the 5, maybe 6 team mark in the Big Ten to get in the NCAA tournament. So this year is just one of those years where an average year for a Big Ten team isn't going to be enough. You have to have that signature victory. Those cupcake games, as you mentioned, the games that weren't cupcakes for the Big Ten teams, they basically lost them. So they're to be had, but they're to be had against the Big Ten, who just hasn't stood out to this point. It's one of those years where you're going to get 5 teams in, 6 teams in, as opposed to 8, 9, because that's just the way it works for the Big Ten this year. There's no dominant team. There's no little crop of teams at the top to get those impressive victories against. So you've got to really make a run in the Big Ten season as it goes along this year. Like you said, there are 3, 6, 9, just looking at the standings now, 10 teams in the Big Ten who have 2 or 3 conference losses. 1 or 2 of those is going to make a big run. It's just a matter of who to make it a 5-6 bid league as opposed to the 8 or 9 that we're constantly seeing out of the Big Ten. It's just a little bit of a down year.
Yeah. And you and I get the privilege to talk about it every week. And how the time flies. The first ever episode, we're just about ready to lock it up. We didn't even talk about the upcoming games, but to be honest, Kevin, I don't think there's anything from this week to next week when we do the show that's really worth talking about, is there, schedule-wise?
No. We mentioned Indiana plays Michigan State, and that's cool, but that's probably the top Big Ten game this weekend.
Yeah, so you got 4-2 against 2 and 3, and honestly, not a lot of. That's what you talked about it over and over. That signature win, it's just not there in the Big Ten. In years past, if Indiana would knock off the Michigan State, that would be like, wow, there's our win, and it's just not there. If Indiana won, it's going to be a win. So I'll tell you what, youngster, it was a great hour. How do you feel? We did our first show. 1 hour in, we're ready to rock and roll and call it a day.
I feel good. You're a little older, so I'm. You call me a youngster. You're a little older, so as long as you're still awake and kicking, that's all we can ask for with a little Big Ten talk for an hour.
Yeah, exactly. And with that, our hour is up. So for the youngster kid Cunny, I am the old man Troy. I hope you enjoyed Go Big or Go Home today. Kevin and I will get back with you next week. Have a good day, everyone.